The year is 1991. The Soviet Union has fallen apart. Some people are celebrating, others are devastated. Everyone had to make a decision for themselves. Where exactly are they going to fit in the new Russian society? Inspired by the euphoric atmosphere and dozens of new profitable life opportunities, people who were unsatisfied with their previous Soviet existence started doing something to change their life around. Some people used this chance to simply leave the country and find a better life elsewhere. Some started opening businesses in fields that weren't taken yet by other entrepreneurs. Those who couldn't create something useful resorted to a life of crime. People with various visions of modern Russia became politicians and independent journalists. Some even attempted to create a global financial apocalypse. There are many ways a person can remember Russia in the 90s. Ask most Russians, you rarely find people who are indifferent or in between. In order to avoid political bias and going off topic, this is a music related channel first and foremost, I will not disclose my personal biases. The one true fact about Russia in the 90s that most people can agree on is that this was definitely one of the most eventful decades in Russian history. It is also one of the few decades where Russia really had its own charm and look to it. The culture became more integrated with the West, yet it was still haunted by its Soviet past. In the middle of all of this freedom and anarchy, a new musical identity was forming. 90s Russia needed new rebels, poets, weirdos, and genres to represent the youth. With the Leningrad Rock Club now being defunct, modern punks had to find a new place to settle and play their music in. These new bands and artists found home in various alternative venues. Places such as Polygon, Moloko, Fish Fabrik, and many more would host the most legendary underground acts of the decade. There was, however, one club that stood out from the rest. A club that took the cliché slogan of sex, drugs, and rock and roll to its extreme. A place so wild and crazy that even liberal 90s Russia had to close it down. I'm talking about the legendary Tam Tam Club. Like many other cultural phenomenons in 90s Russia, this place was short-lived, but the effect it had on Russian music can be felt to this day. If there was a club that defined the rough do-it-yourself mentality of 90s Russia, it was this one. What was it, and how did this rundown squad manage to form the backbone of 90s Russian alternative music? That's what we're going to find out today. To understand why TaMtAm was so important, we need to go back and see what was happening prior to its opening. The wave of interest towards independent Russian music was dwindling away. After a gigantic explosion in popularity during the mid to late 80s, post-punk, folk, progressive, and experimental rock bands were quickly getting replaced by disposable boy bands, such as Laskavy Mai and Neonovые Мальчики. Russian heavy metal went from self-made ripping thrash and power metal to Melodia-generated melodic hair metal clichés that weren't far off from typical Soviet estrada. Huge music icons such as Viktor Tsoi and Mike Nemenko passed away. Boris Grebenshchikov and Vasily Shumov moved abroad without anybody knowing if they're going to come back. Igor Letov dismantled his original Grazhdanskaya Oborona lineup as a protest to the growing popularity of his music. Many bands that were previously a part of the anti-establishment underground environment, such as Alisa, Nautilus Pompilius, and Kalinov Most, quickly found a spot in the commercial charts and radio. Russian punk music went from being intellectual and original to cheap copies of the Sex Pistols that were filled with excessive swearing and lowbrow humor to cover up for the shallow content present. The culture surrounding rock music in the press started changing too. If perestroika and glasnost had started as a reform that allowed for more freedom of expression for artists to enrich their craft, By the early 90s, you had everyone trying to ride the wave of protest music in the country. The quality of everything from the lyrics to the music was downgraded as a result. You now had conscious estrada such as Igor Talkov and pseudo-patriotic pop-rock bands like Lyuber dominating the melodious stores and airtime. Even one of Russia's goofiest comedy rock bands, Duna, would attempt to go serious and political at one point. This normalization of shallow political protest music would annoy some original punks so much that they personally decided to distance themselves away from the political lyrical content. Such was the case with Mikhail Barzikin of Televizor, who at one point was one of the greatest songwriters when it came to radical oppositional music. Most of the forward-thinking music journalists would get more interested in the developing rave scene, and the few rock bands that were getting a lot of attention were Western imports rather than anything local. With the fall of the USSR, interest in Eastern European music fell in the West. Many bands and artists had to return home with their previous critics and detractors, now using their failure in the West as a reason to mock and explain the inferiority of Eastern European music. That's not to say that there wasn't any good music put out at the time. There were still some amazing albums made, albums that have become classics by now in fact. However, on a larger scale, Russian music was in a transitionary period and was in great need of fresh blood to spice up the musical environment. Our story begins with a man by the name of Seva Gakil. Seva came from the generation of Soviet artists that made up the Leningrad underground before Perestroika. He is mainly known as the cello player for Aquarium. Gakil was one of the oldest members of Aquarium. For context, he was the cello player that Grebenshikov kneeled under and got in trouble for at the Tbilisi festival in 1980. You can hear Gakil's cello playing throughout all of Aquarium's Golden Era albums. Now let's fast forward to 1988. Aquarium is recording their album Ravnodenstvie at the Melodious studio. Boris Grebenshikov went from being banned to answering questions at the musical ring, and soon he will have CBS Records release his first solo debut album in America called Radio Silence. While in the US, Grebenshikov would gather up a couple of Aquarium members to tour with him. This was not only important for the promotion of the music, but it was also a chance to get a first-person view of how life and the musical environment have been working in North America. One of the members invited was Seva Gakil. Gakil wasn't particularly fond of Aquarium's new recognition in concerts. Aquarium was now a professional band. The days of experimenting with sound collages at the Tequila studio and comfy acoustic concerts have ended. Grebenshikov is now playing at the David Letterman show, writing music for big-budget Soviet films, and even has one of his videos aired on MTV.
Hi, we're the Pixies, and welcome to Postmodern MTV.
You'll be listening and watching videos from Susie and the Banshees and Wire. And what else, Charles?
Boris Grebenshikov.
There was a positive side to touring across North America for Gakil, however. That positive side being the extensive amount of new music you got to hear and clubs to visit. New York City in particular left a massive impression on Soviet artists. Clubs such as CBGB's were something that the Soviet musicians could never imagine existing. Another major event that happened at the time was the small Soviet tour that Sonic Youth had done in 1989. This was one of the most legendary events that gathered an audience across the entire USSR. These shows would be attended by people such as Igor Letov, Yanka Dyageleva, Volvo Blue, Eugene Hutz, and as you could have probably guessed, Seva Gakel. As a result of this tour, Sonic Youth quickly became one of the most influential bands for artists in Russia, the Baltic countries, and Ukraine.
Переломный пик именно арт, панк, эстетики. И вообще этот концерт, я думаю, он просто изменил мировоззрение всех, кто на нем был.
It would have been great to have something similar, something as wild in Eastern Europe. The Leningrad Rock Club was not able to provide the same level of intensity as the New York clubs and bands. The danger in rock music was gone and something needed to be changed. And so Seva Gakel, a vegetarian and peaceful hippie, decided that it was his duty to elevate the underground scene to a new level of extreme independent music. Seva Gakel found an old Soviet youth center at the Vasilievsky Island that was previously owned by the Komsomol. After talking it out with one of the previous owners, Gakel was given the right to renovate the place and arrange concerts there. It is important to note, however, that throughout the entire formation of the Tam Tam Club, the legal status of the club was questionable to say the least. However, the times were different back then, and so nobody really cared at that point. Gakel chose the specific place because the area and stage were of big size, bigger than in the Leningrad Rock Club, for example. With the location set, it was time to get some bands in. It was the autumn of 1991 in St. Petersburg, and Seva Gakel started forming a new scene in the city. Through word of mouth and some small flyers spread throughout St. Petersburg, young artists started hearing tales of an ex-Aquarium member who was creating a new radical club that was in opposition to the Leningrad Rock Club. In order to perform in TaMtAm, a band had to do the following. 1. Record a demo and send it to Seva Gakel. 2. Play music that was in no way similar to what was played in the Leningrad Rock Club. This policy quickly caught the interest of various St. Petersburg punks and freaks who flooded Seva Gakel with their demo tapes. The main idea of TaMtAm was to allow people to freely express themselves without any regulations and to make underground concerts a regular occasion in the city. Some bands who weren't able to fully provide for themselves financially in the new capitalist society were given places to sleep in at the club. The payment for concerts was usually given in bottles of beer. The bands were more than happy for this sort of payment since everybody present at TaMtAm came for music and the ability to talk to like-minded people rather than money. During the early stages, TaMtAm was a small cult thing that only a small bunch of people knew about. These were outsiders who didn't fit in and found comfort in the sounds of dissonant punk, post-hardcore, noise and psychedelia. In a span of a couple of months, Gakel managed to create a pretty impressive lineup of bands. Let's go over a couple of them. Let's start off with one of the most legendary underground bands in Russian history. Tequilajazz was formed after the disbandment of the Soviet glam punk band Obyekt Nasmeshek. Obyekt Nasmeshek belonged to the same group of punk intelligentsia that some would dub Land Punk. The band was fronted by Ricochet, a sort of Soviet Richard Hell. Ricochet was an extremely charismatic singer that perfectly mixed punk machismo with humorous social lyrics. Although Ricochet was a great songwriter, when it came to straightforward punk and hard rock, other members of the band, and in particular Evgeny Fedorov, wanted to play music that had more room for experimentation and freedom. The band wanted to go beyond the realms of punk rock canon. Obyekt Nasmeshek was a part of the Leningrad Rock Club, but Fedorov knew that with the new radical uncompromising music he had in mind, a new place to perform must be found. TaMtAm seemed like a perfect location. The band quickly started garnering traction amongst the new 90s Russian youth. By the time the band managed to release their first official studio album in 1994, titled Streляли, all the songs had already become underground anthems for the St. Petersburg crowd. Tequila Jazz combined the angry post-hardcore elements of bands such as Helmet with delicate art rock elements and early math rock such as Slint. Tequila Jazz let St. Petersburg know that they weren't playing any games. This was a band that had amazing global appeal and originality. Besides the amazing music that Fedorov and company was composing, I have to give credit to whoever produced the band's debut album. The album still sounds crisp, angry, and fresh. The band borrowed equipment from their old Soviet-era colleagues such as Alisa and Stranные Игры to record the album. Although it took time, the result paid off. Streляли is still one of the biggest classics and must-listens of angry Russian alternative music. Jugendstil was formed in 1990 and fronted by German Podstansky, who was the main decision maker of the band. German started making music in the bard rock traditions as a teenager in the 80s. However, to most people he would become well known as one of the first Russian artists to start playing post-hardcore. German studied at the Soviet jazz school, however his interest in rock music forced him to look for musicians in the underground DIY circles instead of jamming with Soviet jazz heads. German's favorite band was Bauhaus, and Jugendstil's friends in the Soviet scene were Дурное влияние and Matrosskaya Tishina. Jugendstil's style of post-hardcore was quite interesting, less aggressive than say Tequila Jazz and more influenced by British post-punk and gothic rock. Jugendstil quickly started making a name for themselves through extensive touring, including European countries such as Germany. Jugendstil only existed for 8 years, but the band managed to release 5 full-length releases, all of them vary in quality. I would personally recommend starting with the band's self-titled album from 1994 and Никто никому ничего. The band's self-titled is slightly more raw when it comes to the production, but the composition is some of the most original and adventurous that German had made at the time. Никому ничего, on the other hand, is a professionally recorded album that is done in the best traditions of 90s post-hardcore. Knife for Frau Müller was one of the oldest, heaviest, and most chaotic bands during the formation of TaMtAm. Similarly to Tequilajazzz, Frau Müller also started out as an old Leningrad band. However, members of Knife for Frau Müller were outsiders back then too. In the 80s, members of the band belonged to a post-punk group called Bukva O. Bukva O was an extremely hard-working band. According to some urban legends, the band recorded somewhere around 40 albums, most of which are obviously lost now, because come on, urban legend. Anyway, Knife for Frau Müller's music was something completely different. The band's sound was one of the most original at the club, a combination of no-wave, weirdo rockabilly, crust punk, and industrial music. The band's energy was wild and unlike anybody else. Müller's early output, such as the album Patansui, is still one of the most intense album experiences I have encountered. This makes even Grazhanskaya Barona's most noisy output seems chill. The band's most famous album from the TaMtAm period is Senos Krakovac. Although the music is still really good, I think that Knife for Frau Müller is best enjoyed live or in raw demo format, so personally I would recommend starting out with the already mentioned Patansui, if you are a speed and noise fiend like me, that is, at least. A If Knife with Frown Mueller isn't enough and you're in need of more extreme ingredient noise, I would recommend the Dead Hippies, a much less popular band from this era, but one that I found really cool. A band that has a slower and more industrial leaning, but still super heavy and scuzzy either way.
Chimera, наверное, number one. Да, и, кстати, для Севы всегда был номер один, это для Севы Гакеля, я имею в виду. Это группа Chimera, потому что он видел в ней вот что-то такое, чего не было ни в одном артисте предыдущего поколения.
Perhaps the band most people associate TaMtAm with is Chimera. Chimera was an extremely influential, groundbreaking, and original band. Although the band's history only spans a couple of years, their music has left a tremendous mark on Russian music. You can find big-name Russian artists covering Chimera across all genres, from alternative metal kings Psychia to indie rock bands such as Lyuber Outfit. So, what is this band? Why are they so important? The story of Chimera is usually centered around the figure of Eduard Starkov, also known as Red. Although nowadays Chimera is synonymous with the St. Petersburg underground, Starkov wasn't actually from there. Eduard Starkov was born in Kalevala, which is in the Karelian region. For those who aren't familiar with the history, the Karelian region was land that originally belonged to Finland and inhabited by a majority Finnish population. However, following the events of the Winter War, the USSR took this land and did the things you could probably imagine it doing. Starkov and other artists who lived in these areas had a completely different musical identity, one that was a mix of both Northern Scandinavian and Soviet Russian. Starkov and his family would move to another previously Finnish-owned region called Viipuri, which the Soviet government renamed to Vyborg. While in Viipuri, Starkov would start his first band called Deputat Baltiki. Deputat Baltiki played a unique and dreamy mix of post-punk with elements of psychedelic folk and rock music. In the early 90s, Eduard moved to St. Petersburg. While in St. Petersburg, Starkov and other Deputat Baltiki members such as Gennady Bachinsky would form a new band that we now know as Chimera. Starkov always stood out from the rest of the TaMtAm bands. Chimera was one of the heaviest bands, but at the same time extremely catchy and memorable. Their music was both tragic and life-affirming. Chimera was simply a phenomenon. One of the reasons Starkov's Chimera stood out from all the other bands was due to his genuine interest in music and openness to all existing genres. Chimera did something similar to Obyekt in my opinion. Starkov took Western influences and synthesized them with his surrounding and folklore. Remember the place where Starkov was brought up? Well, Finnish and Scandinavian folklore was something that influenced Chimera's music and lyrical content quite heavily.
Где он это взял? Не знаете?
Нет.
Я тоже не знал никогда. А тут мне подарили Калевалу 56-го года или 53-го года выпуска. И когда открываешь фронтиспис, там вот все вот в таких вот человечках.
Ну, в общем, скандинавская, да, символика.
Но он родился же на озере Куйта, это же правда.
Ну, да.
Ну, вот и все. Это район Калевала и есть. И он весь был в символах у него, там, везде четверки, там, да, все.
pretty obvious Slavic and Russian folk elements in there too. As a result of this great cultural background that made up Starkov's childhood, Chimera became one of the greatest things that happened to 90s underground music, in my personal opinion at least. Chimera made some of the coldest and harshest post-hardcore I have heard, but they also made these warm, naive, childlike songs that made you step out of the mosh pit and introspect a little, or even shed a tear. Besides Chimera's one-of-a-kind music, people gravitated to the band due to their eccentric and energetic shows. Chimera was even louder live than in the studio. According to many witnesses, the energy that Chimera put on stage was something otherworldly. Unlike most bands who had their set pre-planned or rehearsed to a point where their music barely differed from the studio recordings, Chimera and Starkov weren't afraid to improvise, pull pranks, such as the time when Starkov took a bath on stage, and even disturbed some of the crowd members. One of the most infamous shows involved Starkov grabbing a syringe, injecting it in his hand, taking his own blood, and then spraying it into the crowd. Seva Gotkel saw great potential in Chimera as a new modern band that could elevate St. Petersburg scene to a bigger global level. Chimera's catalog is an absolute must-listen for anybody interested in Eastern European music or weird 90s underground rock in general. I recommend starting with the band's most well-known and best-produced album, Zudwa. This album compiles all the hard-ripping Chimera tracks. It is a noisy, crazy, and extremely fun album that elevated the post-hardcore and alternative metal genres to a new artistic level.
Шепчет океан, капитан, небо пьян. Тихо шепчет океан, капитан, небо пьян.
Besides Zudwa, I highly recommend checking out Zudwa 2 and Kalevala for the great mix of post-hardcore, experimental rock, and Nordic folk that Chimera was known for. With time, more and more interesting bands started joining the club. We have just scratched the surface of the St. Petersburg underground scene at the moment. We still have a lot to cover, from folk punk to tribal ambient. However, that we will talk about in the follow-up video. So, goodbye for now.